Hello.
Oh boy, we have a good one for you guys tonight. Make sure that you guys are active in the comment section because I think that you guys are going to add a lot to this discussion. But as always, it's Toyd,
Toyd's wrong.
DIY Hi-Fi, and Impulse Audio. What'd you say?
You
Toyd's
said
wrong.
you said as always, and I said Toyd's wrong.
So today we're going to talk about one of my favorite. Actually, I think probably one of our favorite subjects, which is measurements. And today we're going to be talking about why measurements may not matter as much as you think they are. Which measurements are those? Which measurements aren't those? And Impulse Audio is probably going to disagree. And this is a cool thing. I don't think we're going to completely agree all across the board. So there's going to be a lot of back and forth banter. You're going to want to watch this. It's going to be fun. So I brought this up to the guys last week and I said, hey guys, I think we should do a show on why measurement speakers don't matter.
Yeah, this
Hey,
was
True
your
Voice
idea.
It was my original. It absolutely was my idea. I will take 100% credit for it.
Blame.
So Ryan's response. Do you remember what your response was, Ryan?
You said measurements don't matter, and I said I disagree.
That is exactly what I remember too.
You had more to say on that because you agree with measurements. You measure your speakers, and so it wasn't quite carte blanche like that.
No, I think that a lot of times those speaker measurements don't matter, or we put too much weight in the wrong measurements. And today I really want to spend some time talking about that because I think that it's going to be good for not only us, but also for the listeners. So first of all, what do we guys think? Do we think that measurements matter at all? And if so, what measurements do you think are important?
Go ahead, Cameron.
Me or the chat?
No, everyone.
Everyone.
You guys first.
I'll put my neck out first.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'll hit the high notes. Measurements definitely matter. The context matters. What measurements you have matter. I mean, the hits are on axis isn't as important on its own. It tells us a little bit, but without off axis measurements and some resolution, whether that's like 10-degree increments, whatever we're looking at there. But we need sufficient off-axis measurements because we know that sound radiates in all directions. And we live in rooms and we do everything in rooms which reflect that sound back to us. And so we're hearing a ton of the room in our ears. And yeah, that all comes down to what we hear. We don't hear them anechoically like we measure them. Even when we measure them in rooms, people see us measure speakers in rooms and they assume that that's what we're going to hear. But the reality is even our measurements gate out those reflections to a large extent.
They can.
They can.
It depends if you do that or not. So you can also not gate if you want as well.
That's true. So there's a few different reasons we would gate them or not gate them. But yeah, I mean,
what about you, Ron? You want to cut in? I can see it on your face. You're like, man, you're chomping at the bit, man. So my belief is that most measurements that people put a lot of stock in don't matter. And I'm going to explain what I think in a minute, but I want to see what you guys think first before I go off on a tangent.
Well, based on what I'm hearing Cameron say, I think we're all going to agree that measurements do matter. Some of us think more so than some. Like we all have our subjective tendencies versus our objective tendencies. I think measurements matter a lot. I think any data is better than no data.
Oh, I don't know, but I don't agree with that necessarily.
Yeah, but I think that
I'll explain why.
I think the user has to be careful.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people who don't understand what they're looking at can fall into a trap pretty easily. So, and you quickly asked what measurements matter. Well, I think there's hardly any measurements I would dismiss. I don't think distortion matters as much as some people think. I don't know that. I don't know that impedance matters all that much. I mean, you just got to make sure it's not wonky. For modern amplifiers, that is, some people.
Yeah, it depends on what you're actually designing it around. Like there used to be, like with older amplifiers, the impedance, we really needed to make sure that we were keeping it fairly linear in order to get that to the frequency response to react the way that we think it should. But let's talk a little bit about this, because here's some thoughts that I
The
have on
comments are
this.
funny. Sorry.
I know the comments are hilarious. Some of them I don't want to show. But Brian Burrow did say, "Hey, I just bought an expensive mic. Measurements better matter. I have the same one. It's the new Omni mic. For you guys that want to know, the Omni mic 40K is out. They've raised the price. It was supposed to be 500. It actually went up to 600. There's some things that you're going to want to know about that necessarily before you buy it or read the manual. But I'll have a whole video on that." And Lauren Speaker GM says, "Are waterfall diagrams included in the measurements we're talking about?" So let's start talking about what we're talking about. First of all, I rarely think an on-axis speaker measurement by itself is good. But unfortunately, if you're buying an already built speaker, that's almost always what you get. That's pretty much it. That's why I love what Aaron's Audio Corner is doing. He's taking these ones with those, and the reason why we say that. Now, the reason why I say this, and you guys, this is where I think maybe some measurements are not as important or can be taken way out of context, is if you take an on-axis speaker measurement, we don't know if the phasing is correct in the crossover region. We don't know what's going to happen off-axis. Is there like a lot of diffraction going on because of the shape of the cabinet or the shape of the front baffle? So people do some crazy stuff to those that make some pretty amazing off-axis errors that will not only have an issue with when you're listening off axis, but also with your room reflections. And so when I see, speaker manufacturers using this data, it's typically, this data of on axis measurement only, I get very concerned, because I know that all of us have seen a speaker that looks pretty good on axis, and then we look off axis and there's some huge issues going on where the crossover just was not designed correctly.
I agree. The thing about manufacturers, as far as commercially available speakers go, is if you're showing us an on-axis measurement and that's all you're showing us, you've proven that you have a measurement microphone and you couldn't turn the speaker 10 degrees. And if you didn't, why didn't you? And we understand that there are really good reasons for that. The phase at crossover points is something you bring up. A lot of these manufacturers clearly use crossover calculators and things like that and slap them together. And so that may be one reason.
Yeah, I agree with you on that, Cameron. If you can take an on-axis response, you're sure lazy if you're just not going to do the rest of them. And we're talking about anechoic conditions. So we're testing the raw abilities of the speaker, not, in room, you're not going to start twisting your speakers and stuff to see the performance. Like your room is going to do more. That's a different case. But if you're measuring the performance of a speaker, just take the extra time to measure off axis.
And then there's another one that I'm going to, have you ever heard of entrapment? I know you're from Canada. Do you know what entrapment is, Ryan?
Yeah, we speak. Well, I don't know what the context is here, but
I'm gonna entrap Ryan here for a minute, because me and Ryan have had this conversation before with DIY speaker builders. One of the things I love about the Omni mic, the new Omni mic 40K, which there's very limited supply, and I'm not telling anyone to just go buy that at all. You'll want to wait for the video for whether that's going to be good for you. Is the new Omni mic will actually pick out, which Cameron was talking about earlier. It'll help you figure out where to place your impulse so that you cut out your room reflections. Okay, right? But me and Ryan have talked about this before, because Ryan has even said to me, "Nick, I have seen people." I hope he doesn't get mad at me, but I don't care. He said this. It's a long time ago. It was like 5 years ago. But he said, "I've seen these measurements that people have taken with their measurement microphone that have not filtered those out correctly, and I know those measurements are incorrect."
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of amateur DIYers measure their speakers incorrectly, or they'll get a very nice looking response because they measured it in their living room with an 8-foot ceiling. The test system will automatically set the window at like 600 hertz. And then they'll do a near field splice, and they'll get this beautiful flat response from like 100 hertz to 1,000 hertz. And they think, wow, look at that. And I mean, the what the windowing does, like if you window your gate window, whatever you want to call it, if you set that at say 500 hertz, maybe 3 milliseconds or whatever that works out to, your data is crap to about 1,000 or even 1,500. It's just crap. It's just a flat line. Don't even look at it. That's why when I'm doing measurements, I'm trying to get that window out to like 12, 15 milliseconds. So my window is set at like 80. And then I know my data for that speaker is good from 160, 200 hertz and up. Think about an octave. I'm sorry if this is getting really technical, but you don't want to use data below about an
Oh,
hey,
sorry.
you picked this topic and you know where I
No, keep going. About the octave. No, I think this is really good stuff. Actually, keep going.
yeah, no, you want to throw away about an octave above your gate frequency, in my opinion, maybe even two. Like if it's a larger diameter speaker, if I'm gonna be crossing a a 12-inch woofer at like 800 or 1,000 hertz or something, I'm gonna work really hard to get that gate down to 50, 60 hertz because I don't want to use any data. I want good data down below 200 hertz.
Yeah, and there's other ways you could do that. You could do close miking and other ways that you can do this if you don't have a way to get a speaker outside to a good location. We've all seen Ryan put his up on top of a ladder, have it like looking over the ocean, and just playing all of these. All of these to get as little reflections as possible, because the reflections are going to depend on where the first reflection point is in your speaker measurements. And the first reflection point is going to depend on its length or distance to whatever it's reflecting off of. And typically, with almost every speaker measurement, it's going to be the ground. So I know Ryan does a lot of outside measurements. And someone actually asked how high up do we get off the ground. We'll cover some of these guys, but it's really important. Now, one of the things I do want to say about the Omni mic that has really impressed me, and you're going to I don't know if the regular Omni mic will. There's a new software, and I haven't tried the Omni mic V2, but I know the 40K will automatically find the gate and just
a lot of software
put it out.
will, even the
But
the free ones will. They'll at least attempt to find that first reflection. But
yeah, but this one.
I always like to look at the data and actually playback match, and like I like to know the distance, and I will, mechanically in my brain, I'll figure out when that first reflection should occur. And just to quickly answer
Absolutely.
your question, for 60 hertz, you're going to be looking at about 10 feet off the ground.
Now, back to what I was going to say, though, is I think you'll be interested at how well it does. I've taken my speakers outside and measured them, and then measured them with the Omni mic. And the Omni mic does a really good job. They call it the blended mode, and I don't know exactly how they do it as far as the software goes. But I found it to be very accurate of a response. So I'll be interested to hear your opinions when you get one in, because I'll be interested to see if your findings are similar to mine.
So is the blended mode taking the windowed measurements? So say you get data from 200 hertz and up, and then it's taking the raw reflected data and blending them together?
Yes.
Correct.
Yeah. So, I mean,
It
that
doesn't-
works. That totally works, especially 10 feet off the ground or something. Oh, my computer just did a bunch of silly things. Can you guys still hear me?
Yeah, you went
Yeah.
black for a split second, but you're back.
Oh, okay.
Whoa, hey. We don't need to go there, Cameron. Jeez.
So if you're outside and you have near anechoic conditions, so your speaker's up off the ground and everything, that raw data is going to be pretty strong, because that reflection, see, this is the thing, the further away from the reflection you go, not only can you window lower, but that reflection is now very weak, because it is very attenuated by the time it reaches the microphone.
But now we're getting into some interesting information, because most of the time when we see like a manufacturer's response, for example, even of drivers, they don't say how they got it. And we're going to talk about how manufacturers usually get their driver response and why that can be greatly affected by your cabinet here in a minute. But even like, we don't know. Are they using like a gated response? Are they using some will do it like Parts Express will actually say that theirs has been spliced in from a close mic measurement to around 500 hertz. They'll say we've been splicing it in. But it's interesting to think about that because you need to know how they attained those measurements to even know if they're accurate measurements as well. And we talked about this a little bit before the show. Subwoofers are one of the most notoriously bad ones of getting away with probably the fakest measurements I can see with companies.
Yeah.
There's been some good companies like SVS has been doing a good job like tuning their subwoofers to like 17 hertz or so. But how many times do you see a Klipsch subwoofer that's tuned to like 35 hertz or something? And they'll say, our frequency response is from 20 hertz to 200 hertz. And you're like, what? Are you sure about that?
Yeah, especially the mainstream subwoofer builders. Yeah, watch out for that.
And not only that, even DIYers that have been building speakers for a long time and don't quite. I think there's this misunderstanding of being able to hear something and whether or not you're getting usable frequency, because technically 20 hertz really shouldn't. I mean, it's on the verge of audibility. Most likely, what you're hearing is the first harmonic. You're hearing 40 hertz. You're not necessarily hearing, 20 hertz. And but I mean, if you're tuning higher than you're trying to play, then especially much lower, then you got some things. Are you saying measurements don't matter from manufacturers? We are not actually saying measurements don't matter necessarily from manufacturers or from DIYers. What we're saying is that you need to be very cautious about where those measurements come from and what measurements you look at, because some of those measurements may not be what you think they are. Was that pretty fair to say?
I would add to Polly's comment to the answer that when it comes, I use manufacturer's measurements a lot to determine if it's a driver I want to use, but I'm looking at them pretty like high level. Is there a big breakup in the crossover region, the crossover area that I want to use? Often the y-axis, so this is your decibel axis, it's really compressed. So they'll have little increments, and if you look closely, they're actually 10 dB increments, and you're like, holy cow. So even a little blip on the graph is going to be, so
huge.
Yeah. So if you were to measure it my way, like I use 5 dB increments that are nice and chunky, and you can see every little thing. And so that little blip on their graph is going to become a big thing. So you got to look at them really carefully and be critical of what you're looking at, I think.
You know what's funny is I believe it was the Epic Hi-Fi. I build the Epic Hi-Fi speakers on the channel, which is Epic woofers. Those are Dayton Epic, the EPIQUE Epic, and using a CSS tweeter. And I also like to zoom in on my graph to show you what's going on. And I think it was about plus or minus 2.5 decibels, pretty much all the way across the board. It was a very linear speaker. It was really good. And the guy's like, someone responded and said, that's the worst graph I've ever seen. And I'm like, you are used to see. I mean, I didn't say this, but I know for a fact that they're used to seeing manufacturers' graphs that are 10 to 15 decibels. And by the way, we're not talking about just speaker manufacturers. Even if you go to buy a driver, I've seen driver manufacturers that do the same thing. Their graph is so far high up there that you're like, ooh, what is going on? I've even been tricked by Peerless. Peerless would go to 40 kilohertz. And the first time I looked at a Peerless, I was like, oh man, that looks terrible. And then I realized, oh wait, they're showing me past 20 kilohertz. That's why I'm seeing this jaggedness up at 40 kilohertz that I personally don't care about. So you really do need to look at the graph correctly, because not all graphs are the same.
Mm-hmm.
Ryan, tell us about how a speaker manufacturer, a driver manufacturer, will measure their published data. What kind of baffle are they measuring on?
Well, usually they'll use an infinite baffle. And that's, in my opinion, that's the way they should do it. But DIYers have to be careful, because once you put that in a box, it's going to look different.
So let's explain why a measurement would look different on an infinite baffle.
Okay, so an infinite baffle, we call this 2 pi space. It's a big physics problem why we call it that. But basically, all the sound, all wavelengths, even 20 hertz, is going to project forward towards the microphone. Okay, so that means that 20 hertz signal is going to be a certain decibel. But then once you put that in a smaller box, half of that sound, 6 decibels, is going to wrap around to the back of the box and the microphone will never see it. So it's going to look different because the higher frequencies are going to, and this is called baffle step. Okay. I'm sure most of our listeners have heard of baffle step. So
I'm
say
baffled by it.
here, it's very baffling. So a 2 kilohertz signal is going to reach the microphone with full sound power, but a low frequency like 20 hertz is going to reach the microphone with half the sound power. Okay, so it's on the chart is going to go like this. But the manufacturer who's using an infinite baffle, which is, just imagine your speaker in a wall, a big wall, that all the sound power is going to reach the microphone. So it's going to be a much flatter looking graph. So you got to look, because I think it's C's, if I'm not mistaken. I've been out of this biz for a while, so I'm a bit rusty, but I think C's speakers, drivers, they actually measure in a box, and their data sheet will tell you this is on a 10 by 18 baffle or something like that. So you will see the baffle step in their measurements, and then they'll often have a dashed line showing what it would look like on an infinite baffle. And
Now,
so
on the positive note, pretty much every speaker of that same size, I should say, will act the same or similarly, with the same size baffle.
yeah, baffle step is very predictable. In fact,
Right.
there is software you can put the infinite baffle response into, and it'll spit out what it should look like on a baffle, on a like a speaker box baffle.
Based off the size of that, because the
Yeah,
size of the baffle itself will change the frequency at which this baffle step is occurring at.
totally.
I remember seeing the Epic 7-inch, and someone said, "Hey, Nick, would you do a project with the Epic 7-inch, kind of like the Epic Hi-Fi?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I would consider it, but it wouldn't be the Epic Hi-Fi because the Epic Hi-Fi was designed for like a hi-fi response, and the Epic 7-inch, the way it's designed, has, believe it or not, it's kind of interesting. It has basically a baffle step built into it already. If you have, I think it's a 10-inch baffle. So if you use a 10-inch baffle, you're already pretty much have your baffle step already taken. So the problem with the Epic drivers, though, is that they're not sensitive. They don't have a good sensitivity to them. So you almost always want to pair them with a second one. So by doing that, then you're going to get, a big bass hump in the back end, more like a party speaker, which would be fun, be fine. But you have to know, that that's going to probably be what's going to happen with that speaker if you were going to design it. And so in that particular case, I think like those measurements are good. But if you were to take a look at, say, one, most speaker manufacturers do typically make it on an infinite baffle. But if you were to take a look at one of them and take a look at another one, you really need to pay attention to a couple things. The first thing is what Ryan is saying right now, which is, what is the measurement scale? Are we 10 decibels? Are we 5 decibels? Are we 3 decibels? Are we 1 decibel? I like to pick out drivers. When I'm picking out drivers that are on axis, when I think it matters the most is when they're zoomed in good enough that I can get a decent idea of how this is reacting, especially with a tweeter. How is this reacting? And if you scale too far out, then it's very hard to see what's going on with that.
Can we address a couple comments? I'd like to
Yeah,
quickly.
which one?
Uh, we could. Yeah, there's been a lot. Like, we were really in the comments on the last video, but this one, you guys have great questions and comments and everything, and some of them take a long answer, but I'll quickly try my best on a few.
Well, we'll all do it. And Cameron, you got to talk more. We're all
sorry.
like, we're star.
So
Hey,
both
so
of y'all
real
shut
quick,
up.
before you do that, I want to just say, guys, if there's a question you absolutely need to get answered, this goes on 3 different channels. Okay, so we're showing them all right now. The only way that we all like can see it is if there's a super chat. If a super chat goes through, it automatically stars it for us, so we know to look at it. I'm not telling you to super chat us, but I am telling you, like, if you have to have that answer, that's the way to do it. But Ryan, which one did you want to go to? I have a bunch starred.
Okay, I'll just quickly address two at the top there. John says distortion of the bass, that would be revealing. I do agree with you, John. Getting accurate distortion measurements in the bass region is very difficult for the DIYer. I think it's revealing because it's very difficult to reproduce bass notes. It takes a lot of surface area and X-Max from your driver. This is why really good home theater systems will have multiple large diameter drivers to reduce the distortion. The thing about harmonic distortion is that the most offensive ones are third and fifth order distortion. So if you have a lot of distortion at say 100 hertz, you're going to be up around 400 or 1,000 hertz. I'm not doing the math right, I'm sure. Where those signals are going to come out. So your 100 hertz signal that's reproducing a lot of distortion, it's going to be right smack dab in the middle of our most sensitive hearing region. And a lot of people I don't believe think about that. So we often dismiss bass distortion because we can't measure it very easily. But
it is one that when you hear it, you know.
I'm not one to put much stock in distortion, especially harmonic distortion. And like people will measure harmonic distortion in a tweeter, and I think it's fairly irrelevant, to be honest. But bass distortion really can sound like thick mud and crap. So that's a good point. And if I can continue to ramble, I would just mention Playback Mansion says measurements are good for designing, but not for comparing speakers because sound quality is dependent on dynamic behaviors, not steady tone measurements. I have something to say on this. There's been a couple other comments too about, measuring and subjectivity.
Actually, this is actually one of the measurements I wanted to talk about too. So
go ahead. Okay. Maybe I shouldn't spoil it for you, but we can measure dynamic behavior. We can measure compression.
We can. And the new OmniMic 40K can do it very easily, which is actually pretty cool.
With some thought, even a pretty basic setup can do it. You need a quality microphone, otherwise your microphone will distort and you'll think you have compression. Your microphone can actually start to compress and distort.
You know what? I want to stop you for a second.
Sure.
Right. First of all, you've been talking too long. Anyway.
I have. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. Here's the problem that I have, and this is kind of where this whole conversation came from. Why don't we've run across this and we've already talked about it. The problem with a lot of these measurements is getting them correctly.
Yeah.
Getting correct, absolutely. Good measurements. Yeah. And this is where, I've seen, I'm not going to mention a name, but I've seen a guy recently posting a lot about different speakers and drivers and stuff that he's building, and they're wrong. Like the measurements are wrong, and I know they're wrong. Like I can look at it and be like, those are wrong. But I've talked to him before, and he's convinced that they're not. And at some point in time, you just say, okay, to each your own. I mean, if you want to stay there, that's up to you. And that is really one of the reasons why I like the OmniMic system. I really liked OmniMic V2 when it was a lot cheaper than the V3 or the 40K, because a couple things that people don't realize is when you're taking measurements, you have to pick not only the correct sine wave or wave, whatever wave you're using, whether it's a free, whatever tone generator you're using for whatever you're using it for, but you also have to pick it at the right speed at which it's going. So for frequency response, it's going to be like zoop, 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 zoop. But the distortion, when you're trying to measure distortion, you can't do zoop, zoop, zoop. It's not going to pick up the distortion correctly. It's got to go with a much slower signal. So it'll be like zoop, and then that will be how you pick up distortion. The compression that we're talking about right now, I know the OmniMic 40K, for example, will allow you to, it'll give you a graph and it'll show you how much compression is happening at what frequency, because even though compression happens, compression doesn't happen necessarily evenly or linear. So you might get compression at 1 kilohertz, but not at 1.5, depending on the volume and what you're playing on each particular driver. So keep that in mind as well. When we're talking about this, a lot of this, when we're talking about measurements don't matter. It's, do you know how to measure them correctly to get the right response, to get data that we can use.
Yeah. What do you think,
I'm done.
Cameron? Can we measure a speaker? Can we compare speakers with measurements?
Absolutely. 100%. Can we tell exactly how they sound or why they'll sound different?
Yeah.
To some extent, maybe. But subjective, the distortion profile is going to make up a large part of our perception of how something sounds too, perhaps. But I mean, the on and off axis can tell us a lot about a speaker's in-room response, and the in-room response is what we hear. And we can not only predict that, but we can measure that really accurately. And so, yeah, I mean, exact tonality, there are things we still don't maybe understand. But for the most part, we can really, really technically understand what's going on with the speaker by just a few simple measurements done really well. An in-room
Such as
measurement.
what measurements? Such as what measurements? What measurements do you think? Like, if you were to say these are the measurements that I think are most important, what are they? And I want to hear from Ryan too, because I think this comes down to it too. If we think these measurements are important and these are not measurements we're receiving, then that's something we should think about.
Distortion is usually the last. I mean, if I've just whipped up a crossover, I like to measure distortion just to get an idea of what's going on. But I mean, this last 3 days I've been measuring, doing on and off axis, and then I've been not only that, but I can take an in-room response and I can see exactly what I thought was going to happen happened, right? So it's not this guessing game. We can on and off axis measurements can tell us a lot about what a speaker is going to do in a room, and that's kind of all there is to it. You know, like the last 3 days have proven that for me personally. So yeah, I mean, on and off axis, vertical. Do you guys take vertical off axis measurements? How important are they to you?
I take them. Yeah.
To what degree? How high do you go up?
I forget.
What degree?
45 degrees.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is what type of speaker are you designing as well, as far as, you know, and what's your purpose for it. You know, if your purpose is single row seating, then vertical may not matter as much to you. Like if you know, hey, this is where my seat's going to be, this is where it's going to be. Multi-row seating, vertical measures more to you, and of course, obviously, room reflections, it might matter as well. But yeah, I do vertical measurements, absolutely, but I don't put as much stock into them depending on what I'm designing.
But that's a good point. So the speakers I've been referencing I crossed all of them as low as I could. I wanted the widest dispersion from them. And so the off axis was really important to me. But gearing up
Sure.
to do this more pro focused home theater, yeah, I'm going 50 degrees off axis, and that's where my controlled directivity is. And so that's what's most important. And that's where I'm going to prioritize the response. I'm not going to be EQing something 90 degrees off axis. All that's going to be, you know, right in the sweet spot there. So application does matter for sure.
All right, Ryan, what measurements matter to you besides obviously on and off axis? So let's forget about on and off axis for now.
Well, the
We've
question
already
is,
said that enough.
the question was, what's the most important one at first? And I think I would actually say on axis response. If I can only have one measurement, I think I can get a lot out of on axis response, which is why I think you and I disagree on this topic. Because
You know, no, because I don't think you can really get. Here's the deal. If you take one on axis response perfectly, well, we don't know what it's doing off axis, right? What if we take one? Wait. But what if we take one off axis and it looks perfect? We still don't know what it's doing on axis, like because even when we turn it, if we're still out of phase, and all of a sudden at the crossover point we got a big hump there where we thought it would be flat. So
Look,
in
I'm
general, you
not
can't
saying
have one without the other. You can't have peanut butter without the jelly in this case. It has to be both. We have to have peanut butter and jelly. I don't care if you don't like jelly, Ryan, you have to have it.
I like off-axis responses. I think if you don't take them, you're just being lazy. But the reality is, studies have shown over and over again, and my own conclusions have found this to be true, that the single biggest indicator of good sound quality from a speaker over hundreds of blind listeners is a flat response on axis along with an extended response. I think this part's often forgotten. We want a response that reaches low and high and is relatively flat. I mean, I can tolerate 2 or 3 decibels up and down here and there, but that is the single most important indicator of good sound quality. I'm not saying off axis isn't an indicator. I'm saying that's the first indicator of good sound quality. So if the question is what's the most important, that would be it for me. If you want to know what measurements I think a good DIY speaker builder should be taking,
or any speaker that you're looking at, sure.
yeah, I mean any speaker, it's gonna be I'm gonna be looking for that on-axis response that's flat, it's extended, okay. It's got to be extended. And I don't mean I build plenty of speakers without extension below 80 hertz because I pair them with subwoofers, but that's part of the design, okay. So I'm
Right.
looking for that. I'm
You're
looking
not
for
looking at 500 hertz and up. You want to know where it
no,
goes down
yeah.
and low end. Right. Yeah.
I'm looking for a consistent off-axis response. I prefer one that falls off as you move off-axis to reduce the amount of room influence. But if it's consistent and wide, that's fine too. It's kind of 90s to me. That's what people would look for in the old days. Now I think everyone kind of generally wants it to fall off. And then I would say after that, I'd be looking at compression. I'd do that before distortion personally.
And I think these are measurements that we don't usually take, right? Compression measurements. And I think this is one of the ways where I think the new Omni mic will allow a lot of people to get better measurements and get better sounding speakers than they're used to, especially if they're making something like home theater or something that they're going to listen to loudly that that can have large dynamics. Music can obviously have large dynamics. It just depends on how loud you listen to them, right? So I think that compression is going to be really important. And I also, Lorenz Speaker GM asked, "Hey, are waterfall diagrams included measurements that we're talking about?" I think waterfall diagrams can be extremely important to show you any ringing that might be happening. That can really help out when you're doing crossover work. For example, just because a speaker plays flat to 2 kilohertz doesn't mean that it doesn't have issues. So maybe it has a lot of ringing at 2500 kilohertz. So maybe instead of being a 2-way speaker, maybe with that tweeter, it would be better off with a 3-way where you can cross it over a little bit higher and try to get rid of some of that ringing that would be occurring otherwise. I like those measurements. Obviously, I'm a fan of distortion measurements more so than Ryan. Obviously, Ryan hates distortion. Actually, he loves distortion.
No, I don't.
Give me more distortion. He said, "Give me more distortion." and then some other ones that I think a lot of people don't take into consideration are ERB measurements. And I think ERB measurements can be really helpful to a lot of people.
What are ERB measurements?
So an ERB measurement is an on and off axis measurement, frequency response, but it's this type of smoothing that's applied. So instead of being like a 12 decibel per octave, and by the way, this is the other reason why we haven't talked about why measurements are bad, is the amount of smoothing that some people put on it. It's like insane, right? Like it's crazy.
You can smooth out a choppy measurements, like butter.
Oh, it can look amazing. Yeah, you can make a terrible speaker look great with the amount of smoothing that you apply. And by all means, guys, if we take a measurement, we can just go in our measurement program and we can change the smoothing to whatever we want. Now, typically it's about 112 is what most people are measuring speakers at, some 124 around there. 1.3, you'll see a lot of people that are doing it. But ERB, the reason why they did that is it's supposed to typically simulate more of how you hear. So the way that you can look at an ERB measurement, if you're designing a speaker or if you have one that is already built, is you can see if there's any major or even minor humps that are coming up that are like, that's where that's coming from. That's what's bothering me, because it's going to give you a better idea of how you specifically, well, a human in general, hears that speaker. It is a very smooth measurement though. But the only reason why you're using an ERB measurement is to look to see if there's major dips or major peaks that are still occurring with your ERB.
What does it stand for?
I have no idea. Ear retention benefit.
I'll take it.
That's not true. I have no idea what it stands for.
On the topic of smoothing, so we're designing a speaker. All of us are probably using 12 octave smoothing. If you're going to hand those measurements off to the end user, is 12th octave as important, or do you want to do third octave smoothing so that they have a more general understanding of what they'll hear rather than the end user paying attention to the little peaks and dips that with passive crossovers you just can't EQ out and fix? Do you think the
All
end
right.
user needs to see 12th or third?
I use
Let
no
me.
smoothing.
Here, I'm going to
sorry?
read this. I'm
Go
going to
ahead,
read
Nick.
this. This is Google, so it's got to be right. ERB is a measure used in psychoacoustics. Only the psychos use it, which gives an approximation to the bandwidths of the filters in human hearing. Now, it's not perfect, right? Like no one's going
Oh,
to say, "Hey, look at
I
this
think I've
ERB."
heard of this. Yeah.
Yeah, it's no one's going to say it's perfect, but if you can find an issue in your ERB and you're hearing an issue, most likely it's happening at that issue that you're looking at in ERB.
Hmm. Yeah, I've never dove into that, but I think I've heard of that. Yeah. Lorenz says,
Here's
are waterfall diagrams included? We still have that one up. You know what? Sometimes I have to remind myself that CSD is more important than I think it is.
cumulative spectral decay is what he's talking
Yeah,
about.
yeah. Sorry.
I think it can be. It depends on how bad it is and where it's at in the response. I like to pay attention a lot between 1 and 3,500 kilohertz because that's usually where most people are most sensitive.
But just keep in mind if you're comparing, like some manufacturers will include it, you now have a third axis that can be used, just like we were describing that y-axis to make it look better. You now have a third axis, the time axis, that can
Yes.
be used to screw with you. And so you got to look at that because they can compress that chart as well in two directions.
Yeah. In our software, you can zoom in as far in as you want on that and make those look better or worse. So
yeah. And once again, another concern. So Polyvoxel's been asking a lot of questions. G. Smith, by the way, does think that decay and waterfall plots are pretty important to take.
I'd agree
That's
with G.
completely
Smith. Yeah. I sometimes in my videos, if you watch my videos, I'll go, don't pay much attention to this. You know, I show it because people ask, but yeah, it's more important than I let on.
It is, but as long as you understand what you're reading.
You got to know what you're looking at. You got to know what you're looking at. Sure.
Because that's kind of the issue. And really, honestly, this is kind of the problem with a lot of these measurements is a lot of people are starting to get these measurements, but they're like, I don't really know what this means, but it looks good. And you can take a waterfall measurement and make it look good too, even when it's not. So you gotta be careful with that. But I don't know if this is relevant, but this is Polyvoxel talking, not me. But how do you perfectly time align subwoofers to our main speakers? I tried using impulse response, but the graph looks completely different to the speaker impulse. Anyone, you use time alignment, obviously use delay, and you usually use the impulse. So I'm not sure what you're seeing that's different. So
I would actually use distance. I would just use distance, convert that to milliseconds.
Physical measuring.
Yeah. So I would probably, if my phase on my amplifier and whatever else you're using, DSP, if it's all set to 0, I mean, ideally you have multiple subwoofers in your room, and I would just forget this whole concept altogether, Polly. I would just tweak phase or delay or whatever you're using until you have a nice blend at the crossover point and EQ from there. But if you are really concerned about it, perhaps your subwoofer, you know, you're using it around 150 hertz or something, and so you're a little more concerned with it, then I would use distance. And if you just take the speed of sound in meters, sorry, how would you do that? So you would go the distance divided by the speed of sound should give you your time, and then you can take that time and put it into your DSP. So
and we're not blending these measurements, we're gating them. These are all reflections, right?
Well, I think he's in a room.
Yeah, you don't. When you're in a room, you do not want gated measurements. That's another thing. And I have seen people give room measurements with gates, and
Yeah, they look great.
Yeah, they look fantastic. I've seen that way too many times. They're like, "Look how flat my subwoofer is," and I'm like, "Yeah, okay." And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just you don't know necessarily how to take those measurements, and that's okay. One of the things that I actually like to do, and for example, if I've built plenty of sealed subwoofers, and I'm a big fan of big subwoofers, high efficiency, using 21, 24-inch subwoofers and keeping them sealed and allow your room to do the rest, assuming your room is sealed and it's somewhat normal sized, not this ridiculously huge mansion or a gymnasium. That's going to be a little bit different than what I'm talking about. And one of the great measurements that you can do is you can measure your subwoofer at the cone. Okay. And that's going to take away almost all of your room. Okay. So someone had asked before, how do we take away the room? We do near field measurements. You can take away the room on the base side. Okay. I think it was Dan had asked that earlier. How do we take away the room? Near field is a great way to do that. When we do that near field measurement, that's going to show us what the speaker or subwoofer is doing. And then you can take that same microphone, put it at your listening position, make sure you don't have any gating on there, and take a measurement. And now you're going to see what your room is doing with that bass as well. And you'll be surprised at how much low end extension that was not on the graph in the first time will be on the graph the second time, especially with the sealed, because you can get a lot more room gain than you would with a ported subwoofer because of the slope that you get. And so I'm a fan of doing that. I know that I wasn't sure exactly what my room gain was going to be, but I guesstimated it based off of measure. By the way, you can guesstimate that. You can even put it in WinISD to get an idea of what you might be getting. And I got to be honest, when I took the final measurements, I was surprised at how close it was to my guesstimate. I mean, it was pretty much spot on. And so it worked out really well in my room. So those are some good things to be able to take and figure that stuff out with the math. I went over it in the video that I did. So if you're interested in that one, it's called I Love Big Subs. No, I don't remember what it's called.
And when we say near field, that means the mic, the close mic, is like a 1/4 inch away from the cone of the driver. So all those reflections are out of there.
Yeah.
Yeah, just not too close. Like if you're going to be really pushing that subwoofer, not too close, because don't hit the microphone.
Yeah, well.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah, close, but you also have to remember to turn it down or you'll clip your microphone.
Overdrive. Yeah.
Exactly.
Can I just address MW there? And I think I should also just clarify with Polly. When I say that, I'm not measuring the delay. I'm saying measure the distance between your speakers, measure the distance like from where you sit to the speakers and where you sit physically to the subwoofer physically. The distance difference is how much longer the sound has to travel to your ear.
So if it's 2 feet and then if it's 2 feet from your speaker and 1 foot to your subwoofer, then you take the difference, which is 1 foot.
Yeah. And then that extra time, you can input that delay, that much time into your DSP or whatever you're using to give you the delay. And like I'm saying, it isn't perfect. I'm also suggesting that Paulie not get too concerned about perfectly matching time aligning his speakers to his subwoofers, because at those low frequencies you really should just be more concerned about getting all the room reflections and everything to give you constructive what's the term? I'm too rusty
interference.
On this stuff. Yeah, constructive interference, thank you. You don't want destructive interference, so that's when the waves are blending together and everything. So yeah, I'm not saying you measure delay. If you want to measure delay,
I just gotta say this real quick. Cameron doesn't say much, but when he does, it's like clutch, isn't it?
Yeah. Thank you. I'm just such a blabbermouth,
This is Ryan and Nick's night. Y'all been measuring speakers for quite a bit longer than me, so I'm here, but I want to listen to.
No, we all have opinions on this. I do want to ask this question. Plus, Zarbo's always been a great.
I was looking at that one.
And this, I think, this is actually, there's been a thought going through my mind on this. So I'm curious what you guys think about this. But do you guys ever just throw a best guess crossover together and tinker without taking measurements? The answer is I have done that a few times. after you've measured like a 6.5-inch woofer so many times and a 1-inch tweeter so many times, you have a pretty good guesstimate of where your how far off your z-axis is going to be. Now, it won't be perfect, but it can be a good guesstimate. So if you can have enough time making enough speakers, you have a pretty good idea of what that is, and you can guesstimate and try to do this. But I'm going to take this in a little bit of a different direction, and I want to see what you guys think about. And one of the questions I get a lot is, why don't I just use a pre-designed crossover? And we know all the issues with the pre-designed crossover. Baffle step compensation that we've already talked about. The phasing between them is going to be an issue as well. But
Yeah,
I
phase.
think it's possible. And here's what I'm thinking. You take your whatever drivers you think might work well together based off of the research that you've been doing. You might have to work with the width of the cabinet depending on what the inductor size is, as far as, where's the baffle step actually occurring and what can we do with the speaker, etc. But then physically moving the tweeter back in order to time align it physically, or maybe even angling the baffle to get it physically time aligned, as well as then the width of the cabinet, come into a situation where it could actually work. Now, you'd still have to attenuate the tweeter.
I like this idea. I think they'd make a really, really cool video to do that in reverse. Start with a prefabbed crossover and reverse engineer a speaker that matches it.
And it would be interesting too, because then people could actually.
Can you imagine?
Like you say, did you say it's a terrible idea? Right?
I don't have the time. I would throw it through the wall so fast.
But technically, it should be possible. It's just a matter of what do we have to do?
Do any of them offer attenuation, or is it all just filters?
They tell you to buy an L pad, I think.
Yeah, you can buy a variable L pad though. For example, like Parts Express sells some. It's literally like a little knob on the back that you can variably attenuate. Now, whether it attenuates it evenly,
right?
I don't know. I've never used one, so I don't know if it's going to be like a linear response or if it's going to be like, like
curve, or the top end off,
or the bottom end, or I have no idea. All that is.
Playback Mansion says, put the sub. This is something we hear online a lot. Put the sub in your listening position, crawl around. Now, there's not anything wrong with this, but what I want to ask is, have either of you guys ever actually done this?
Do the subwoofer crawl.
That's
watermelon.
That's
what it is.
I've ever done it.
It's called.
I don't think I've ever done it, but I believe it works.
Sure.
If you don't have a microphone, it's actually probably not a bad way to go.
Yeah, it helps you find nulls in your room, etc., where you can, place that subwoofer. There's absolutely no reason why you can't do that. I don't use that particular method myself, but there's no reason why you couldn't.
If you do it, even if you don't have a microphone, you should be able to get a sine sweep somewhere. Get like a 0 to 300 hertz sine sweep, or the full thing, and play it slowly. So you can listen to it. Lots of sweeps, like my measurement sweeps, they'll be like, whoop. We get one that's real slow. Whoop. And because,
whoop.
Yeah, not that fast. Nice and slow. And listen. And listen to it a few times in each spot, because I think most people who do this, they'll put on like some kind of electronic bass music or whatever, booch, 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 and then they crawl around. Well, you're finding the spot that sounds best for that one note wonder, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
What I find funny is my car, for example. I have the speaker system's terrible, and it really is. But it has a subwoofer that plays like one note. It is.
Hertz.
I don't. I have not tested it, but when it's hitting and when it's not. Most of the time, it's not. And that's another thing that where measurements can be good is taking an actual in-room measurement where you're not. Once again, we're not filtering out anything. We want to know what and where you can actually see that. Now, what you can do, like, well, we're talking about this subwoofer thing, is you can actually physically move the subwoofer and watch your graph move. And you'll see those peaks go down. You'll see those peaks go up. You'll see those peaks go in other cases. You'll see big old dips going on. So you can do that. And I think most of us that have done that, that's the way that we do it with the measurement equipment. If you don't want to use measurement equipment, you could do the subwoofer crawl. And like what Ryan's saying, another way that helps that out is just multiple subwoofers.
Yeah, I mean, if you can afford it, I would take 4 8-inch subwoofers over a single 15 any day of the week. I mean, if you can get 4 subwoofers, even 3 is kind of the minimum, to be honest. You hardly have to measure. I mean, it does the work for you. You know, it smooths all those peaks and dips and everything out to a point. I mean, it's not perfect, but
And I had so many more comments pinned that we did not get to. I want to touch on one more because we touched on this, but I don't think that we really did answer this completely. How do you determine if you're measuring the speaker or the room? We told you how to measure the speaker by itself, which was you know what? I think we did really answer that. You got to do a near field measurement and then a room measurement, and you'll find that out pretty quickly.
yeah, I mean, he might
Both.
be he might be I think a lot of people get confused and they're wondering if they think the room measurement is better because that's what they're hearing. But I think it's an important distinction to acknowledge that research has shown us that the direct sound we get from the speaker dominates our neuroaudiology or whatever it would be called. So although room measurements are important, I'm talking like 200 hertz and up here. What the speaker is doing anechoically, even if you're not measuring that with a microphone, which is really dumb compared to our brains, it's actually what you're mostly hearing. So getting that anechoic measurement, that's most of what you're hearing. The rest of what you're hearing is the room, but it's as you go higher in frequency, it's less and less. Now, you know, below 200 hertz, it's all about what the room is doing. So measure that. The anechoic measurements below 200 hertz are really more about the performance of the speaker and what it can offer. But yeah, that's something people get confused about often, I think.
Yeah. So the great thing is, I actually thought we would be disagreeing more than we did, and we actually kind of agreed
still
on
all
pretty much
wrong.
everything. We're all still wrong. What'd you say, Ryan? I'm sorry, I booted. Oh,
Delete the podcast.
I just lost Ryan. Sorry. The truth of the matter is, though, in general, you need to worry about taking the measurements correctly, and there's a lot of ways you can do that. I know most of us have videos on taking measurements correctly, but get involved and don't be afraid to ask questions. I think that's been like the biggest fear with a lot of speaker designers is they're afraid to come up to people that do know what they're doing and ask questions of them. There was a great resource. Jeff Bagby was a great resource of that. He unfortunately passed away. He was a great resource a lot of people went to. There's a lot of great Facebook groups that people can go to, a lot of different places that you can go and get that information if you need it. And obviously with YouTube and things of that nature, it's so much easier to get more information on this than you've ever been able to before. There was a time with us growing up that if you didn't know someone that did this, or really like honestly like knew them face to face, you probably weren't knowing how to take correct measurements or what measurements are important, what measurements aren't important.
Yeah.
We live in a world where you can go on Facebook and get an answer from Andrew Jones, if that's your thing, for free.
That's amazing.
Yeah,
He's in there responding
true.
to Joe Blow. It's kind of crazy. Like, this guy probably doesn't have any idea who he is, and he's probably looking over Andrew's response. But it's like,
me and Cameron went out to eat with Andrew Jones last time at Dayton Audio Parts Express competition, the speaker design competition. I mean, it was great to be able to talk with him
you guys are lucky.
and listen to him. And, well, you could have gone. You just had to fly from Canada.
No, that's an awesome. Yeah, he's an amazing resource.
Oh yeah,
When I first started,
and he's honest with it. And you know what I love is so funny. It's like he'll give a response to someone, and there will be people that are like, "Yeah, you don't know what you're talking about," and I'm like, "Oh man, you really don't know who you're talking to. you have no idea who you're talking to right now." It's funny, but Playback Nation has it right.
Totally. Yeah.
Asking stupid questions constantly is the only way forward. I personally don't think there's a stupid question when we're designing speakers because none of us know everything. I don't know everything. Cameron doesn't know everything. Ryan doesn't know everything.
I didn't know what ERB was.
Yeah, I mean, come on. I mean, everyone knows what ERB is, except for Ryan.
Except for me. I'm such an idiot.
No, I mean, but that's the great thing about it is that we should be constantly learning and pushing each other to get forward. And that's really what this podcast is about. And so, guys, if you liked this show, make sure to hit that subscribe button to each of the channels, DIY Hi-Fi, Impulse Audio, and me. We all have different videos out on this topic all the time. So make sure that you're subscribing and ring the little bell. If you ring that bell in the it'll give you the notification when that new video comes out. That way you can get this. Now, don't forget to join us next Wednesday. Cameron's going to come up with the idea, so it's going to be really exciting.
I feel like we could have almost done 3 of this show.
What'd you say?
I feel like we could do this show 3 times, like this topic. I mean, there's just so much to cover with measurements, but we're not going to do it twice in a row.
I think what you meant is that everyone should watch this show 3 times.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
No, but seriously, if you got anything out of it, just don't forget to hit the like button, like Your Voice of Region said. But guys, we are going to let you go. This has been our hour with you guys. We really enjoyed it. Anything you guys want to say before you go, or would you like to mention any videos you have coming out?
Ryan?
I don't have any videos coming out. I think I said last week that I get my life settled, so I need a little more time to do that. But I do hope to get back into it soon, and I'm excited to do that. So
cool.
Yes, Gene, it is weekly on Wednesday at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time.
Yeah, related to the topic, my next video is going to include a lot of measurements, some good, some questionable. After that, we're going to do another breaking build. That'll probably take a little while, so I don't know what I'll do in between that while I'm working on that. But that's what
dude, if you haven't watched his last build video, it was really cool. It was one of those, like, you can put it on and just relax all day, just watching him build a speaker. It was really neat.
Fall asleep if you need to.
Actually, I did talk to someone, and they said they fell asleep and they woke up and it was still going on, and they
do that.
It.
That increases my watch time.
Yeah, do it. Yeah, do it when you're going to sleep. So I have one coming out on the Acoustos AC650 coming out this week. It's really neat. It's a DSP amplifier. Some of you guys said, hey, some of the way to simplify some of this is by using DSP. I don't necessarily disagree with you. I think that's going to be really exciting. It's a really interesting amplifier that's coming out. I'm actually pretty excited about it. I think you guys will like it as well, especially if you've been wanting to get into DSP, because they make it very simplistic. And that's the thing that I really like about it. It's a lot more powerful than you would think. And in some ways, less powerful than you think. But I'm not going to ruin the video for you. Also, I just came out with a desktop monitor computer speaker shootout. It came out a little last week. If you guys want to watch that, I reviewed Dayton Audio, Atom Audio, Edifier. Oh, who else was in there? Oh, Hi-Fi. And you'd be really surprised to see who won that one. I did not expect it, but the winner was very clear. It was very clear. And it was not who I expected. And I'm very happy that I did it. And there's actually one of them that I don't even use. And you can find out which one that one is too. And I would tell you, don't buy it. There's a much better one. They're all different price points too. I think 100, 125, 300, actually 125, 150, 300, and 400. So something for everyone's price range.
You should build gigantic monitors instead if you're going to watch that video. Just kidding.
All right, guys. We'll